Hey everybody, how's it going? I'm Paul, I'm with the Dicey Review, and today we're going to be taking a look at the 1 to 3 player exploration sandbox game Forgotten Depths. Now in this game you control one of 3 different characters as you explore different levels or ecologies, as the game refers to them, of this awesome fantasy world. How does it play? Let's see. Forgotten Depths comes with all of the components that you see here, including hero mats for the 3 different characters, the ability cards for the 3 different characters, the item cards for the different characters, and then the action card decks for the characters, separated into normal action cards and item action cards that are indicated by a chest on the front of them. The game also comes with a health track board, 3 separate monster decks divided into different levels of difficulty, 1, 2, and 3, and a number of items to help set up the different levels of the dungeon, or the ecologies as the game refers to them. The game also comes with a pad of adventure record sheets, hero record sheets, purple monster health tokens, black monster health tokens for the 3 characters, ability and item tokens, a lantern meeple, key tokens, double-sided encounter tokens, and a number of item tokens and fabled blades. To begin setup, first determine which level or ecology you'll be playing in the game. It's recommended that you start by playing the Ruins level. Shuffle and place a stack of each of the feature, monster, and Stair Guardian cards near the play area. Next, you'll need to set up the legendary locations in the game. There are 4 different legendary locations in each game. Look through the legendary location cards and find any that have just a number on the back like this, and sort all of those cards together and put them in shuffled stacks. Then group all of the cards together that have a number and then a letter following them. For instance, we have a few different 1B cards here in this stack, a couple of different 1C cards, etc. And make sure that the highest Roman numeral card is on the top and the lowest Roman numeral is on the bottom of the stack. For instance, this stack is 1B1 followed by 1B2. This stack is 1C1 followed by 1C2, etc. If there's a case where there's more than one card that has the same letter and Roman numeral, for instance, if there were 2 3C1s, you would just shuffle those cards to create a stack. Then find the level reference card and make sure it's within easy reach of all players. And then locate and place the health track so that it can be reached by all players as well. Each hero will have a matching health marker, and you'll place that hero's health marker on the space that's indicated at their starting level, and all heroes start at level 1. So you would place the markers on the matching space of the health track. Each hero mat will list the hero's name and their class, and it will also list the hero's abilities, as well as indications of where particular cards will go around the player mat. Each hero will also have a deck of action cards that has their artwork on the back of it. Find the 2 power cards in your deck and place them above your player mat. They start the game prepared and ready. And then shuffle the rest of your player cards that don't have the treasure chest icon and place them to the left of your player mat as a draw pile. Once the players have done that, find the map tiles for the current level that you're playing. We're starting off on the first level, or ecology, known as the Ruins. Place the entry tile in the center of the play area and put the lantern token on that. Then set the stairs tile aside, shuffle the rest of the map tiles, and then deal 3 out face down. Put the stairs on top of these map tiles and then place the rest of the map tiles on top so that the stairs is the 4th from the bottom. These map tiles can be placed off to the side after this is done. There are 3 different monster decks with a Roman numeral 1, 2, and 3 on the back. Find the light monster deck with the Roman numeral 1, shuffle it and place it near the play area. Each hero also has a power card deck indicated by this symbol and an item card deck indicated by this symbol. Shuffle these decks and place them near the play area. You also want to find all of the item action cards that you set aside earlier that have the treasure chest on the front and set them nearby the play area as well. Each character would then be given 3 key tokens, and then make sure that there's a supply of the encounter tokens and the item use tokens within reach as well. There are other limited use tokens and fabled blade tokens that may come up during gameplay depending on which features or legendary locations players encounter, and those can be located and placed in the play area if needed. After this has been done, players are ready to begin playing. Forgotten Depths can be played with up to 3 players, and there are 3 different heroes to choose from. Typically, the way the game is played is each player will control 1 hero, but the game can also be played with a single player controlling more than 1 hero. We're setting up a 2-player example where each player would control 1 hero. In a game of Forgotten Depths, players will alternate between 2 separate phases. There will be the exploring phase, and then players will have some type of an encounter. After completing an encounter of a particular type, players will go back to exploring until they decide to choose another encounter. During the exploring phase, heroes will explore the map by placing new map tiles. As they do this, players will build out the map while they play. Players will do this in turn order, placing 1 tile at a time. And there are a few rules about placement. When placing tiles, walls have to line up with other walls like you see here, and heroes have to be able to trace a path from the current accessible area where they are to an accessible area on the new tile where they've placed it. It's important to note that map tiles will have different types of ecology elements that they can encounter by placing new map tiles. This map tile, for instance, has 2 different monster icons. This means that 2 monsters would have to be encountered, and certain elements will block a player's progress until they're encountered. For instance, the players would have to resolve encounters with these 2 monsters before they could move past them. But once again, players can freely place these tiles in such a way that would avoid potentially dangerous encounters if they want to. It's also important to note that there are some map tiles that have black dotted lines that separate the tile into 2 different areas. For instance, as you can see here, this small pathway is marked by a black dotted line at the entrance. That effectively separates the tile into 2 different paths, so players can freely go along this path without having to encounter this monster if they want to. It's also important to note that as tiles are placed, there will be areas that are created that are inaccessible to the heroes, which is totally fine. Players can use the lantern token as a reminder of which areas are currently accessible. It's also important to note that players can lose the game if they draw a tile that they can't legally place. If that happens, then players have reached a dead end in their exploration and the game is over. So players should keep this in mind when deciding if they want to try and draw another tile to place. The exploring phase ends when players decide that they want to stop placing tiles. When that happens, players will have to encounter one of the different elements on the map. There are a few different elements that players can encounter on the map marked by these different symbols. These symbols here, for instance, are monsters that players will have to face off against. These symbols here are features. Players will also have access to campfires or chests. In addition, by placing map tiles in a way that these node symbols line up in particular patterns, players can also encounter legendary locations, which we'll look at in a moment. And finally, near the bottom of the ecology, players will encounter the stairs, which is their ultimate goal for escaping the encounter. But to do this, they'll have to have a battle with a Stair Guardian, which we can look at in more detail later. After players are done placing tiles and decide to encounter one of the ecology elements, they would move their lantern marker to show which element they want to engage with. For instance, they might choose to engage with a feature, like this. If a player chooses to engage with a feature, they would draw the next card off of the feature deck to resolve. Features will provide players with a potential amount of experience points, and there are other effects that features might give players. For instance, this feature gives players the ability to assign future features in a specific order if they want to. Many of the features will also ask that players pass a certain type of test. For instance, this falling block trap says that players have to draw cards of a specific value, and if they're unable to pass this test, they would each take an amount of damage depending on the amount of players in the game. For instance, if they failed the test and there were 1 player, they would take 2 damage, 2 players, they would take 5 damage, etc. And it's important to note that these symbols indicate that the value would have to be equal to or greater than the number shown. Any cards that players have to draw as part of a feature test would be discarded to their discard pile. When a feature is fully resolved, a player would cover up the feature icon with one of these tokens, showing the gold slash side face up. And regardless of if players pass or fail a test on a feature card, once resolved, they would place the feature card in a communal XP pool, and this XP could be spent in the future for various different benefits, which we'll look at in a moment. It's also important to note that a feature would block a player's ability to move down that hallway until it's resolved. So if this feature hasn't been resolved and isn't covered with this token, players can't move past it until they resolve that feature. Once resolved, however, the players can freely move past this feature. Players can also potentially encounter monsters. If a player is resolving a monster encounter, they would draw a card for each monster icon, so in this instance they would draw 2 monster cards. When a player encounters a monster, they would draw the next monster card off the monster deck. When encountering monsters, if there are multiple monsters, players have to decide which monster will engage which player. So in this example, the Withering Shade would need to be assigned to the fighter or the rogue, and then vice versa with the Spectral Knight. There are multiple different types of monsters as well. There can be singular monsters like this Spectral Knight, or there can be monsters that come in pairs, groups, or hordes. For instance, this Withered Shade is a group monster, which means that there are 4 individual monsters in the group. You can also see this by looking at this chart on the bottom of the card that shows 4 different columns. When encountering monsters, you'll place the monster health tokens depending on the type of monster card that you're facing, and depending on the health value in the slashes on the card. So for instance, this Spectral Knight would gain 11 health in a single-player game, 22 in a 2-player game, and 33 in a 3-player game. So in our example, this monster would have 22 health. The Withered Shade would have 4 separate monsters, each with 8 health in our 2-player example. When marking health for the monsters on the health track, if there's more than one monster, you'll want to use different colored monster tokens to assign the health for each monster. So in our example, we'll use the black token to indicate the health of the Spectral Knight, and then we'll use 4 separate purple tokens to mark the health of all of the monsters in the group of the Withered Shade. After health tokens have been placed on the board, players would make sure to find the appropriate level of monster action deck and place it near the play area as well. This is the deck of cards that the monsters will draw from to fight during the encounter. Once the combat setup has been complete, combat will then proceed over a series of rounds following a set number of combat steps until either the monsters are eliminated or one of the heroes is killed. If multiple players are playing, they can complete these steps simultaneously for the monsters that they're fighting. So for instance, the player playing the fighter would complete the same steps as the player who's playing the rogue at the same time for each monster. The first step in each combat encounter is to draw cards. Each hero would draw up to a hand of 3 cards. If any power cards are drawn during this step, the power card would immediately be placed in one of the 2 spots that says power, and another card would be drawn to replace it. And if a player doesn't have enough cards in their draw pile to draw up to 3, they would have to first empty their hand, playing any cards they have left, before shuffling their discard pile and then drawing back up to 3. The next step after drawing cards would be to play cards, and it's important to note that heroes have to play their cards before the monsters play their cards. If a player is playing a monster that doesn't have any health states like what's shown on the bottom of this card, they would just play 2 cards to the play area. So for instance, the rogue would choose 2 of their cards and play them face up. If the monster card is a non-singular monster card like this group of Withered Shades, the monster card will have a diagram at the bottom that shows the particular health states and how many cards are played, depending on the number of monsters that are left. For instance, if there are still 4 monsters in this group, both the monsters and the players will play 2 cards. As the players defeat the groups of monsters, however, they'll gain a slight advantage as the group of monsters shrinks. So for instance, if there are only 2 monsters left in the group, the players would still get to play 2 cards, but the monsters would only get to play 1. So in our example, after both players had played their cards, it would look something like this. Any action cards that are left in a player's hand would remain there for the next combat round. Then the monsters would play their action cards. If there are no health states, so for instance like with this singular monster, the monsters would play 2 cards. And if there are health states, like on this non-singular monster, once again the column that relates to the number of monsters that are currently left indicates how many cards would be played by the monster. In this case, 2 cards would be played. It's important to note that if a monster ever draws a power card, it would immediately be replaced with another monster card, and then the monster who drew that power card would resolve their power ability, if applicable. If a monster doesn't have a power-activated ability, like in the instance of this Spectral Knight, the power card would just be discarded without any effect. And it's also important to note that a power ability can only be activated once per combat round, so if a second power card is drawn, that one would be ignored. After revealing the action cards, players have to select and resolve a combat pair. When choosing which combat pair to resolve, players have to take into account some hierarchy. If there's a combat pair that shows the same value, this would be a block. Blocks take the highest priority, so players can always select to resolve a block if they want to. Monster hits are the next highest priority and must be resolved if a block isn't present. So in this instance, there's two different pairs, one where a player has the higher value than the monster, and one where the monster has the higher value than the player. Monster hits are higher priority than player hits, so in this situation, the player would have to resolve the combat pair where the monster has the higher value. It's important to note that if a player had a block in this other pair, they would be able to resolve the block instead of the monster hit because blocks take the highest priority. In this situation where the player has a block or a player hit, the player can decide which pair they want to resolve. A player can, if they want to, choose not to resolve a block, to resolve a player hit, or to resolve a monster hit. If a player resolves a block, no damage is dealt to either party, and if a player resolves a block, they're also able to resolve any block abilities they might have on their player card or on item cards. If a player hit or a monster hit is resolved, damage is assigned in the same way. If it's a player hit, the full damage equal to the value on the card would be dealt to the monster. So in this instance, 7 damage would be dealt to the Spectral Knight, and that could be indicated by moving this health marker down to the appropriate value. The difference between the two values would also be assigned as return damage. So in this instance, the difference between these two cards is 3. That means that the monster would do 3 return damage to the hero. Damage from monster hits is assigned in the exact same way. In this instance, the monster has a hit, meaning they would do a full 6 damage to this character, and the difference between these two cards is 1, meaning that this player would do 1 return damage to the monster. It's also important to note that after revealing cards and before assigning damage, players can also spend their stored power cards to activate any power abilities. This can be very helpful in changing the situation and allowing the players to do damage, or be able to block an incoming attack. And it's important to note that heroes can use power abilities as many times as they want, as long as they have the power cards to pay for them. Some wizard abilities, when used, instruct a player to exhaust the ability. After utilizing this wizard spell, a player would rotate the card in a 90-degree angle to show that it's exhausted. The spell can't be used again until it's unexhausted. We'll look at how to unexhaust a spell later in the video. If players do damage to a non-singular enemy, so an enemy that has a group or a pair, etc., whenever they do damage, they select one of the markers to do the damage to, and if that marker is ever fully depleted, meaning that one of the monsters is defeated, that group is then reduced by that amount. So for instance, this group of 4 monsters, if defeated, would now be 3. When drawing action cards, the player would then check the 3rd column to see how many cards are dealt by each side instead of the 4th column. This is once again because now there are only 3 monsters in the group instead of 3. It's also important to note that players have to assign damage to one monster in a group. They can't split it between multiple monsters in a group. If there's more than one monster hit when a player has to resolve a combat pair, they can choose which pair they want to resolve. And likewise, if there's more than one player hit whenever a player is resolving a pair, they can choose which one to resolve. It's also important to note that there are situations where the player will only be able to play one card, and there are 2 monster cards being played, depending on what the health status of a group says. When playing one card against 2 monster cards, the player has to assign the card to the pair that would be worse for them. In this case, there's a tie, so the player could choose. But if the situation looked like this, the player would have to assign this 4 to the 6, as that would be the worst pair for them. The reverse is true whenever there's 2 player cards and 1 monster card. The player can choose which card the monster card has to pair up with. After resolving combat pairs, any cards that were played would be discarded to the appropriate discard pile, and then players would repeat this sequence again, starting at step 1, drawing cards. If there's only one monster out and there's more than one player playing, each player would draw and resolve cards against the monster. So in this instance, both players would play 2 cards, and the monster would play 2 cards for each player. If a monster is defeated as part of combat, so for instance if one of the monsters in this group is defeated, players will be able to avoid some return damage. If a player is able to defeat one monster just using their own combat strength, all players avoid return damage during that combat round. If multiple players contribute to the defeat of one of the monsters in a group or a monster by itself, one of the players that took part in doing that damage would get to avoid return damage. Players will continue to evaluate the combat steps until either the monster is defeated or one of the players is defeated. Any card left in a player's hand at the end of combat will remain there. If monsters are defeated, their cards will be placed in the communal XP pool that can be spent later. Players may also run into a door. Doors will block movement until they're encountered, and you can't move through a door until you use a key to unlock that door. Players have a limited number of keys that they start the game with, but once you've used one of these keys to unlock a location, you can place that token over the door to show that you can now move through that portion. Players may also encounter chests as part of their exploration. When a player encounters a chest, first they would have to deal with any monsters that might be present in the same space. For instance, this chest has one monster that has to be resolved before players can access that chest. Encountering this monster would follow the same rules that we just covered for combat. And it's also important to note that in this particular example, the players would have to face these two monsters before they would have access to this tile. But when a chest is encountered, one hero is able to draw a card from that chest. So in our example, either the fighter or the rogue would be able to draw a card when accessing this chest. And it's up to the players to decide which hero will be the one to draw an item. In our example, we'll say that the rogue would be able to draw one of their item cards. When a hero receives an item like this, they would place it along the bottom of their player mat like shown. Heroes are limited to equipping up to 2 items showing a hand icon, and it's important to note that items can be equipped or unequipped at any time while exploring. Only the abilities of items that are currently equipped can be used. And it's also important to note that items can't be equipped or unequipped while you're encountering something, only while you're exploring. This buckler, for instance, would provide 1 armor, which reduces incoming damage by 1 for this character. Some cards will instruct players to add cards and remove cards from their action deck. When this happens, players will first combine any cards in their draw and discard pile, and then look through their action deck that has the chest symbol in the top left. The player would then add the cards with the specified value to their deck. After doing this, they would then remove cards from their action deck equal to the number that's shown on this card. For instance, this one says replace 2. They can pick any cards they want to remove, including one of the ones that they just added. In this example, we could remove these 2s and then leave the rest in the action deck. After that's done, the player would then shuffle their cards to form a new draw pile. Once a chest has been encountered on the map, players would mark it with a gold / token to show that it's been encountered. Players may also be able to encounter legendary locations through clever tile placement during their exploration phase. On the edge of some tiles, you'll notice nodes that look like this, these circular locations here. If players place tiles in such a way that the shape of the nodes on the connected tiles creates a match that matches one of the legendary location cards, players are able to encounter that legendary location just like they would a monster or a chest or a feature. And the pattern can be rotated or flipped. If players decide to encounter a legendary location, they would draw the top card off of the legendary location stack that they've matched on the tile placement. They would first follow any instructions that they may see on the text field, and then they would pay attention to the letter and the number that's shown in the top right corner of the text field. This tells them which stack to draw from next for that particular set of legendary location cards. In this instance, the player would draw from stack 1C, so the players would then draw the next card from the appropriate stack and continue to resolve the locations. As players resolve legendary locations, you'll see that the cards are laid out and start to form a panoramic picture. Players will continue to draw cards from the appropriate stack until they've fully resolved an encounter. So in this instance, the players would then draw the next card from stack 1C, which would then give them the final card in this particular legendary encounter. This final card would give instructions that the player must follow, and after following these instructions, the player would then be able to place these legendary encounter cards in their shared communal XP pool. Each legendary location can only be encountered once per ecology or once per level. So once the players have encountered this location, they can't encounter it again for the rest of this ecology or the rest of this dungeon. Once these nodes have been used to encounter a legendary location, the players would cover them with an encounter token with the gold side face up to show that these nodes can't be used for any further encounters. It's also important to note that using the nodes on one part of the tile doesn't block the other nodes of the tile. For instance, the player could use these nodes to encounter that legendary location, and then use these in a later legendary encounter if they want to encounter location 2, 3, or 4. Players may also encounter a campfire. There's only one campfire in each level or each ecology, and heroes will be able to rest at a campfire once per level. When the heroes choose to encounter a campfire and rest at this location, each hero will heal equal to half of their current health, which in our level 1 example would be 15 health for the fighter and 13 health for the rogue. Each hero would combine their discard pile and their draw pile and then shuffle those decks. If playing with the wizard, any exhausted abilities would become unexhausted. Players would keep any stored power cards, they wouldn't go away, and any defeated monster tokens would be removed from the board. These locations would now have monsters present again. The last type of location that a player can encounter would be the stairs that has this hand icon on the tile here. When encountering the stairs, to descend to the next level and play the next ecology, players would have to first encounter a Stair Guardian. And once the players choose to encounter this Guardian, they would no longer be able to revisit any of the other tiles' locations. Essentially, this would end the level. To encounter a Stair Guardian, the players would draw the top card from the Guardian deck, and then they would resolve combat with this Guardian using the regular combat sequence that we discussed earlier. If this Stair Guardian is defeated, all of the heroes would be allowed to level up. This means that their health value would be increased to the next level. Each hero would then fully heal, and then players would be able to buy abilities. Each player can look at the reference card for the current ecology that they're playing to see how much it would cost to buy a power card per hero. In this first level, it would cost 4 experience points to buy a new ability. Players have to spend the experience points by discarding these cards in their collected communal XP pool, and it's up to the players to decide which cards are discarded to be used to pay for this. After players have paid for the upgrade, they would draw 2 cards from their ability deck and decide which card they want to keep. After deciding which card they want to keep, the other ability card would be returned to the bottom of the deck. Players can then use the provided hero and adventure record sheets to save their adventure so that they'll know how to start when they want to play the next ecology. Players can continue to play through each ecology, playing the game like a campaign. They would win the campaign if they defeat the final entity at the bottom of the 3rd level, and they would lose if they ever draw a tile that they can't legally place, or if either one of the heroes is killed. It's important to note that players can spend the experience that they've collected in their communal pool during their adventure for certain things. For instance, if you look at the reference card for this ecology that we're playing, the players could spend 2 experience to buy a key token, and players can also spend experience to heal their characters. It would cost 1 experience to give 1 health to the different heroes. When experience is spent, it's removed from the pile and placed back in the box. Players can't ever get change from what they've spent, so if they spend something that has 2 experience for something that costs 1, they don't get to keep that 1 experience. It's also important to note that some items will have an experience value as well. Equipped and unequipped items can be spent to buy things during the adventure or to level up as well. Alright everybody, that was our video. Thanks so much for watching. We hope that it was helpful and we hope that it was informative. If you have any questions about how to play the game, please comment below and I'll do my best to answer those questions. Make sure and check out our social media pages and connect with us there. And if you enjoy the content that we're putting out, give this video a like and give us a subscribe so that you'll see any of the new content that we put out in the future. Alright, thanks so much for watching, and until next time, I'll see you at the table.